Welcome to the Edinburgh Talks Climate podcast. I'm David Porteous, and joining me today to talk about energy are Bryony Peace, who's a technical officer from Home Energy Scotland. Hello.
Hello.
And Liam Kidd, who's an affordable warmth advisor from Changeworks.
Hello.
Hello. So, all of these podcasts are about sustainability, different aspects of sustainability. This one is about energy, and particularly about energy use in the home. Why should we care about the amount of energy that we're using in our homes?
I think there are three main benefits to paying attention to the energy use in the home. The first one is financial. If you can make your home nice and efficient, then it will cost you much less to run. The second might be comfort. So if your home lacks insulation, doesn't have an efficient heating system, then you might not be comfortable. So an efficient home will keep you warmer. And then finally, from an environmental perspective, if you have an efficient home, you're reducing your carbon emissions.
Yeah, so that financial one's probably the thing that most people think about in terms of the impact, because they see it coming out in monetary terms.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that why most people contact you for advice about energy savings or anything else, your organisations?
I think money is always going to be a motivator, and I think the important thing is there's varying levels of action that can be taken when it comes to energy efficiency.
So when people are contacting you, some of the important things that we want to do with this podcast is to highlight some really simple, practical advice for people. So if you've got someone who's contacting you who's currently on low income, living in, let's say, a tenement property in Edinburgh, what's the easy first steps that you would encourage them to take to reduce, just firstly, the cost of their energy?
I think you can always start about how you use appliances within the home, reducing the electricity usage first of all, how you use your appliances, things like the washing machine, for example, looking to switch that down from a 40 to a 30. These sort of quick wins, all sort of more simple action like switching off lights when you leave rooms, replacing bulbs with LEDs. Again, everything to reduce the electricity consumption. And then there's the material improvements you can make as well. That might be draft proofing. Lower cost materials that you can use to draft proof letterboxes, keyhole covers around doors and window frames.
Keyhole covers as well? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's often one that gets neglected, but it's effective. The wind can whistle in through the keyhole, so it can help. So
I remember that my granny, she had a large stuffed snake that she would lie at the bottom of doors to prevent drafts coming through. Even something like that worthwhile to do?
Absolutely.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned LED light bulbs. Are all energy-saving light bulbs LED light bulbs, or are there multiple forms of technology?
There are different types. So people might have compact fluorescent lamps, the ones that are sort of in the bars, or the twists that were maybe more popular before LEDs. So they're still energy-saving light bulbs. You're still doing well with those. But there's more and more options through LEDs, which are perhaps ever so slightly more user-friendly.
So your early energy-saving fluorescent bulbs, those would be the ones that sometimes you turn them on and they take
a little while
5
to
minutes.
warm up. Yeah, precisely. So if you've sort of done the ethical thing and switched to one of those, but it's driving you mad, you could go for an LED and you wouldn't have that drawback.
So I think there's a lot of perceptions around those light bulbs as being a less, exactly as you're saying, user-friendly experience. But now that's not the case with LEDs.
Not with LEDs, no. And the range of LEDs, they used to be quite expensive to install, and they're still maybe a little bit more expensive. But because they use so much less energy, they'll pay for themselves quite quickly. And, you can now get dimmable LEDs and all kinds of options that you wouldn't have had before. So that's a nice, quick and easy one that if you've not upgraded your light bulbs would be a good one to go for. I think another one not so much changes to the home, but if you're talking about reducing your costs, is switching supplier. And this is something that Liam, I think, works a lot on with his clients.
Yeah, so a lot of the householders that I support, a range of householders, but including those who are in or at risk of fuel poverty, where, again, where budgets are constrained, then it's really important to make sure you are on the cheapest supplier for your heating and your electricity. And as well as that, it's also worth considering how you want to pay for your heating and your electricity as well. Whether that's generally a direct debit is the cheapest way of paying, where you pay a fixed amount per month based on what your supplier thinks you'll use over the year. So it's important that you give regular meter readings so they're able to keep that accurate. For some households, maybe a prepayment meter might be more suitable, so they can keep a clearer eye on their budgeting. And there are other ways that you can pay, like quarterly billing, receiving a bill every 3 months. A bit harder to budget because of the changes in the summer and winter bills, and it's also the most expensive way of paying as well. So I think that's before you decide about switching supplier, it's important to consider how you want to pay as well. And when you do a comparison of suppliers, it's a good idea to make sure you've got information like who your current supplier is, the name of your tariff. Ideally, you want to base it on how much electricity and gas, for example, that you're using over 12 months, just to take into account the seasonal differences. This is all information that you can find on your bill, or you can request from your supplier. And armed with that information, you can then have a look at an online comparison website. For example, the Citizens Advice Bureau's comparison tool. Again, put all that information in, and it'll give you a sense of sort of what the quotes are. And because you've put your own usage information in, you can feel a bit more confident it's tailored to yourself, rather than just basing it on, say, a 3-bed house or what have you. So,
sure.
Yeah.
In your experience, what kind of savings would a person normally expect to get from switching energy supplier? Yeah,
I think generally I've seen householders that have saved over £400 a year from switching, especially if you combine changing the payment method. Say if a householder is paying quarterly billing, they switch supplier but then also change to monthly direct debit. That's where you can further increase the savings, but I wouldn't say it would be out of the question. A sort of average figure, maybe around £200, £250 a year through switching, and generally it's something that we'd recommend looking at every year. If you come to the end of a fixed tariff, or if you're on a variable tariff, you can really keep an eye on that more regularly.
So there's still potential for people to save money even if they've already switched supplier in the past, in the last couple of years. They should still keep looking into that.
Yeah, very much so. And a lot of householders, and again, perhaps they've had bad experiences with switching, which is understandable. That could put you off. But the important thing really is that you don't get rewarded with your loyalty to the energy suppliers. So,
it's true.
Yeah,
it's true. It's sad, but it's true.
It's sad, but it's the reality. So really taking control yourself and having a look to see what's out there puts you in the best position to make the most of the savings that are there to be had.
Okay.
I would just add that if anybody is uncomfortable using the online comparison sites, there are other options. So there are impartial phone services, and that's something that if somebody was calling into Home Energy Scotland, we would discuss that. So if somebody needed a little bit more support, we would make those referrals, so that if they felt like they couldn't do it on their own online, we'd get them a little bit of assistance there.
That's great. We'll have some information about that on the dialogue site in relation to this podcast as well. Presumably, if you're contacting people by phone for that advice, you're going to want the same kind of information to make that better, though. So you're going to want to know name of your current energy supplier and the amount of usage that you've got on your current
That's
tariffs.
not something that we'd need at Home Energy Scotland to make that referral, but yeah, absolutely, you're precisely right. When you're actually speaking to an advisor who can help you with that comparison, they'd want that same information that Liam's just outlined to get you the best deal for your specific needs.
Okay. So if we can reduce down the amount of the cost of the energy we're buying, I suppose the next question is for that typical person living in Edinburgh, what are the big ticket items that can reduce down the total amount of energy that they're using? I mean, you mentioned insulation. Well, we mentioned draft excluding, really was what we were talking about there. My perception, we were having a quick conversation earlier on, was that a lot of the insulation of properties in Edinburgh had been done, but I think that's not the case now.
I think a lot of people have made a lot of insulation upgrades, certainly, but I do a lot of home visits myself, and you'll find that there'll often be further opportunities. In the home, about a third of your heat can be lost through the walls, just on average, and a quarter of your heat can be lost through the roof. So a lot of people in maybe stone build properties, for example, they can't get the just sort of quite straightforward cavity wall insulation, so there are a lot of uninsulated solid walls out there still, or maybe people with lofts that have a minimal bit of loft insulation, but not maybe the sort of full 270, 300 mil insulation that we would recommend. So I think there probably are extra bits of insulation that a lot of householders could look at, and again, we give tailored advice on that.
So stone walls, terrible for insulation, basically, just bleed heat. Is that what we're saying?
They're just a little bit trickier to insulate, so it's a bit of a bigger job. You're looking at usually internal wall insulation, especially with something like a tenement building where you're not going to cover up that lovely sandstone property, are you? So you're looking at a rigid board insulation internally. So it's just it's a bit of a big job, but very effective.
So there's obviously a lot of listed buildings in Edinburgh, a lot of properties which are in, not necessarily listed themselves, but are in conservation areas, so have restrictions around them. I suppose how does that make a difference for the advice that you actually give people about what they can do for their home in somewhere like Edinburgh, where they have that many planning-based restrictions on what they can do?
That absolutely can play into people's options. So, for example, with windows, if you're in a listed building or a conservation area, you might be restricted. It's very unlikely that you're going to get permission to replace your single glazed windows with UPVC double glazing, but it doesn't mean you don't have options. So secondary glazing is quite a nice option, where you leave the existing window untouched, but you essentially add a new window on the other side, so you've made it into effectively double glazing, and that can have a real impact on reducing heat loss through the windows and through drafts. So what I guess the message that we would want people to understand is, although it might not be quite as straightforward, you definitely still have options.
Okay.
And just to add as well, I think as with anything, as technology improves, the ways in which you can insulate properties and improve their properties efficiency-wise, there's more options really. In like floor insulation is another one as well. Perhaps falls down a little bit on the pecking order between walls and the roof with the amount that of heat is lost. But
because hot air rises, right? Yeah. I paid attention in physics, I know. Okay.
But you can still find properties that have quite a large cavity under the floor, or an area that's harder to access, and you can insulate under the floor with like a netting where you can hang the insulation. there's also technology now where you can send tiny robots under the floor to insulate it. Maybe not as dramatic as that sounds, but
that does
it's
sound
really
dramatic,
yeah.
though.
Just to say, there's different solutions for harder to treat areas.
I
which
feel
gives
like in
more
the
options.
next Mission Impossible film, we should see Tom Cruise insulating his house using a tiny underfloor robot.
I'd watch that.
Yeah. And I suppose when you start to talk about things like that, how will people know what the best sort of options are for their property? Is this something that they need to speak to an advisor about, or is this something like if you have a house, you know that you will 90% of the time be able to insulate under your floors, and this is just something people know, or do they need some specialist advice about this?
I think a lot of people will have, especially if you've recently bought a property, or energy performance certificates. If there's been one carried out for your property recently, the banding of A to G, efficiency rating, and there will be recommended measures to improve the efficiency. So that's a good starting point.
So that's required as part of the home report now when you're buying and selling a house, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then also contacting someone like Home Energy Scotland, who's a free and impartial advice service, and they have people like Bryony who can go out and do the technical visits to give that more tailored advice on what solutions are available for the harder to treat properties would be another good starting point.
Okay.
So the usual starting point for householders is just with a chat, exactly like Liam has said, to one of our advisors. We'll have expert advisors waiting to chat with householders about what will be the best solutions for their particular home, so taking into account the construction type when the property was built, lifestyle, heating systems, these kinds of things. And then if the householder is looking for more specialist advice, if they're looking to do a big job like internal wall insulation, and they think a home visit would be useful, then yeah, that's definitely something that we could investigate with them.
Okay. In terms of the, I suppose the bigger items, I see more and more, even particularly new build properties actually, which are built now with solar panels.
That's right, yeah.
On the roof. But a huge number of, in fact, I would probably say almost all of Edinburgh's tenement properties appear to not have any solar panels on the roof. That's, from my perspective, that seems to be about the fact that this is one roof shared between 8-10 owners, and no one really has a huge amount of responsibility for it. Is that the main reason why we don't have a lot of solar panels on that roof space?
Yeah, I think we have more and more people making these kinds of inquiries because, as you said, bringing down people's bills is a big motivator for them to look at energy use in the home. But with the climate emergency, more and more people want to do their bit to bring down their energy emissions, and people think of solar. Unfortunately, in a tenement building, that's just a little bit tricky practically, because your solar is generally hooked into one person's electricity meter, so it's likely to just benefit one household, but it's a shared roof, so it becomes a little bit tricky.
Yeah. And you were saying earlier that most of those properties also probably don't have appropriate roof insulation as well, for much the same reason, that it's one shared roof between 8-10 households.
Yeah, well, I'm in a tenement flat and I'm in the top floor, and I know I don't have good flat roof insulation. So yeah, that would be something that people in tenements could look at, maybe rather than going all the way to trying to install renewable technologies that might not be suitable for their particular property. What can they do to reduce the energy demand in their home?
What's the ideal property for having solar panels actually installed on it?
I think there are lots of properties that could be well suited to having solar panels. We do have a sort of bit of a basic checklist. You don't absolutely need your roof to be facing south. That would be great, but anything between southeast and southwest would give you a really good output. And even in fact, if you're roof was split to the east and the west, you could still, if you had a big enough demand for electricity, it could still be worth your while to install solar on an east and west facing roof. Even if you have garden space, so your panels wouldn't necessarily have to go on the roof. They could be ground mounted, they could be mounted on a flat roof, so a garage roof perhaps. Where you would situate your panels, you would want that ideally not to be shaded, of course, especially not in the middle of the day. And then you just want enough space. So if you're only going to have room for a couple of panels, that might not get you a very good electricity output. So it might not be worth your while to go for solar photovoltaics. If you did have space restrictions, you could consider something like solar thermal. So that would be to generate your hot water rather than the panels that are generating electricity. So the PV that we've been talking about. And then the last thing is your lifestyle, really. So your solar panels are generating electricity whenever the sun is shining on them. But if you've left the house at 8 in the morning and you don't get back until 6, then you're not going to get much opportunity to actually use that free electricity. So would want you to consider, do you have some time through the day where you can run your appliances for free on your free solar electricity and actually get a benefit out of the solar panels?
I hear from, science fiction that Elon Musk is doing really well in terms of batteries for home energy storage. How far are we from that being a viable option for the average person in Scotland, to have a battery which is storing things on either free energy from solar or cheaper energy from discounted tariffs, depending on time of day?
We already know of quite a few householders who have decided to go ahead and install batteries usually alongside the solar PV array. So while they're out during the day, their battery can store their solar electricity and then they can use it in the evenings. So yeah, batteries are a great way to improve your self-consumption and reduce what you need to buy from the grid. But you're absolutely right, with more and more sophisticated time of use tariffs becoming available, some householders are buying electricity when it's cheaper, maybe looking at selling it back to the grid, or just using their battery to tide them over peak times so they don't need to buy very expensive electricity. So
hang on, is there someone out there right now who is buying cheap energy from the grid and then selling it back a couple of hours later? Is that really happening?
I'm not sure that we've got quite that set up right now, but I mean, that's the benefit of smart meters, really, looking at using energy smarter. So you mentioned all that renewable capacity for generation that we have, but if it's being produced while nobody needs it, then it's just going to waste unless we can store it. So yeah, actually, if a lot of domestic households had batteries and they were happy to have some sort of contract with their energy supplier, then it would be useful for the grid for those domestic batteries to soak up some spare renewable electricity, either from their own generation or from the grid, and then be able to sell that when there are times of demand.
Wow, interesting. So we've talked a lot about insulation, we've talked a lot about energy tariffs. Some of the major things that people use energy for, obviously, in their home is heating their house and heating water in their house. What kind of options do people have in terms of improving their costs, energy consumption, carbon footprint, all that? So
heating and hot water accounts for about 53% of the household bills.
Wow.
So
actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you immediately. It's like one of the things we've discovered from talking to people is that saving water is the least meaningful change in terms of things that they're willing to do, because they perceive that as today, it's raining all the time, so why would I bother saving water? But actually, if more than half of your costs are going into heating that water, surely that must change the way people think about saving their use of water.
I think it boils down to things like shower time, having showers instead of baths, all sort of simple things that you can change yourself for free before you even think about how efficient your heating system is. Even if you switch out a couple of baths a week for showers, reducing your shower time from, some people might take half an hour in the shower, changing that down to 15 minutes, which is still quite a long time. Average that out over a year, that could be quite a saving for people. And even from, say, 10 minutes down to 5 minutes, 5-minute shower. Once you sort of get used to that, it tends to stick with you. And that's the sort of probably the easiest way people can save on the hot water is through sort of baths and showers, as well as sort of using hot water for things like the kitchen, dishes. So it's really important to be mindful whenever you're using hot water, to make savings that way. In terms of the heating systems, we would definitely recommend people to have whether it's a gas boiler, oil boiler, electric storage heating as well, which is the main sort of common types of heating for Edinburgh householders, to have them serviced regularly every year from a safety point of view, but also to help maintain their efficiency. Even if it's just given a bit of a clean, that'll keep it ticking along. And also an engineer will be able to offer a bit of an insight into sort of is the heating system dropping off in efficiency? Is it becoming harder to scramble around for parts if something needs to be replaced? So having it serviced does give that aspect, and I think the replacing a gas or an oil boiler, you can either go like for like, or you could consider like a renewable. We've talked about solar panels, renewable heating options as well. Things like air source heat pumps, if your home's quite well insulated, they could also be worth considering. And that's again going back to Home Energy Scotland and what Bryony does in visiting householders and giving all this information so they can make sort of sound judgment on what they want to do and how they can improve the home.
Long term, are we thinking that everyone should be moving to an electric boiler? Or are we still saying dual fuel or gas is a better idea?
I mean, I think there's sort of legislation being discussed that in the next couple of years, maybe new build properties will stop having gas central heating automatically being installed.
So, as Liam was saying there, what that means is that your availability of parts for gas boilers is almost certainly going to go down if you're not going to get any more new build properties with gas central heating installed.
I don't think anybody needs to panic about that just now. There's still an awful lot in the way of gas boilers out there. But we will be moving away from that being the sort of automatic first choice for your home, I think. You mentioned electric boilers, which for some people electric boilers will work, but we would be very worried right now with the fuel costs of them being very expensive to run. So, maybe 3 or 4 times as expensive as a gas boiler right now. So people are maybe becoming motivated to look at their alternatives to gas heating. And we would suggest, rather than going straight to a electric boiler, something like Liam mentioned a heat pump that might give you 3 or 4 or even 500% efficiencies depending on the type of heat pump that you go for, which means that your running costs are reasonable. So it's definitely not a question of just cap the gas and get whatever electric alternative.
And a heat pump is doing what exactly?
So a heat pump, it's not a combustion system. It uses a refrigeration cycle. So same sort of technologies as you would get in your fridge freezer. Mm-hmm. So it's drawing energy from whatever source. It could be air source, so you've got a fan unit drawing energy from the air. It could be ground source, you're drawing energy from the ground, or even water source. Not many people have that option available to them. And then the heat pump uses that refrigeration cycle to basically scale up that available energy and pass it into your radiator system or your underfloor system. So it just drives a usual central heating system.
Wow. So are we, in the same way that we're maybe thinking about getting rid of gas boilers as a first option for new build properties, are we also thinking about installing heat pumps, ground source heat pumps into properties more as standard as well? Or are we just hoping that insulation and technology and whatever are going to fix the difference in running costs between those two systems?
So do you mean running costs of sort of a heat pump versus
gas versus electric?
Yeah, I mean a ground source heat pump already might run more cheaply than a gas central heating system, and an air source heat pump, although we think it might be ever so slightly more expensive to run than a condensing gas boiler, might not be a big difference. So they're already pretty competitive. So in new builds, sometimes, you across larger developments, you'll sometimes get offered, do you want a gas boiler in your home, or do you want a air source heat pump already? And a lot of the people that we speak to, they might be doing their own self-build projects. A lot of them are going for heat pumps to heat their home.
It's interesting. Okay. What sort of space would you need outside if you were doing that? This is maybe too technical.
You're really getting into it. For an air source heat pump...
Look, I've got a garden that's this big.
Yeah.
I want to know.
For an air source heat pump, you just have that fan unit, so it looks much like an air conditioning unit that's going to usually sit along an external wall. So it's obviously not a huge amount of space that you need to give over for that. For a ground source heat pump, you're going to need a lot more space, especially if you're going for a horizontal collector. So you're looking at digging trenches. So that's quite a lot of space that you're going to need. You could go for a borehole, so you could drill vertically. That would be another option.
Okay.
But yeah, these systems, we talk about them because they should be more sort of affordable to run, and there are incentives available for them right now. They're not a sort of they're not automatically going to be appropriate right now. Ideally, you want quite a well-insulated home for them to work effectively. So if somebody was considering that option, they could certainly call in and we would have a good chat with them about if it's going to be feasible for them.
Okay. And we've had on and off conversations here about metering, or rather controlling within your own house when heating is coming on and coming off. What, I suppose, again from your experience, to what extent are people doing this right just now, getting the best out of timing of their heating systems, and to what extent is somebody just switching on the heat in the morning and then leaving it on all day and that's it?
In terms of the households that I visit, there can be some households maybe that are a bit wary of adjusting the controls out of fear of knocking them off. The heating's coming on in the middle of the night. And there's also some households that perhaps haven't lived with a particular type of heating before. Maybe they've lived in a home with a gas boiler and they've moved to somewhere with electric storage heating, which is a different type of heating system altogether. So I think that at the heart of it is really tailoring the controls that you have to your needs, your comfort needs, but also your routine. Most gas boilers, you'll have a programmer that you can time, maybe up to 4 time periods a day when the heating actually comes on. So really thinking about what time are you getting up in the morning, during the week, is it different on the weekend, giving yourself maybe half an hour for the heating to come on before you wake up, just so everything's quite comfortable. And then also, if you have a thermostat on the wall, generally we would say between 18 and 21 degrees, aim for that as a starting point. And the difference a degree can make is quite subtle. but I mean possibly could save around £80 a year. And it's really just
by going down 1 degree.
By going down 1 degree. So it's really just adjusting the heating controls as the seasons change as well, and as your need for the heat changes, and other things as well that seem quite trivial. But if you have a gas system, oil system with radiators, making sure that the thermostatic valves on the radiators are only really up in the rooms that you want to be heated at the time. For example, you might all be in the living room, the heating's on, no problem with that, but there's a bedroom that no one's in, and the radiator valve's all the way up at maximum for a number of hours. So it's just picking up on these things as well. I spoke about electric storage heating. That's something that can be a bit trickier to control, in a sense that you have to predict how much heat is needed for the next day. The more traditional type of storage heating will have an input and an output dial. So the storage heaters charge overnight on a cheaper rate of electricity. So the higher the input is set, the more heat that will be charged up available for the next day. The more that's charged up, of course, the more it will cost. So before you go to bed, you want to have an idea of what the weather's going to be like. Are you going to be out at all? And it will require a bit of experimenting, but that's a lot better than just sort of having it on maximum and you're possibly not using all of that the next day. And then there is also the output dial, which dictates how much heat is released. So again, a good suggestion would be making sure the output isn't on maximum before you go to bed, so none of the heat begins to flood out when you're still in your bed. Turning that up in the morning to build the heat. If the heat builds up, reduce that back a little bit. So you're just trying to manage the heat during the day to make it last for the evening. And if you're able to control how the heat's released while retaining your comfort, it's possible that you can lower how high the input is set. And if it's not charging up as much, then you save on the electricity and also your carbon emissions as well. So you can see how the storage heaters require a bit of guesswork, but once you find what works for the different weather conditions, it's something that you can stick to. And I've visited households as well where, unfortunately, they find that the bills are really high, but the home's not getting warm. And I've identified that all the storage heaters are up, the input's up maximum, but the output is completely down and it hasn't been adjusted. So you can see the impact that can have on someone's comfort, and their bills can be quite big.
So a storage heater, so this isn't a battery. So what physically is a storage heater? Where's the heat going? So
the storage heaters, the more traditional ones, will have bricks in them. So they charge up overnight, more normally for like a 7-hour period overnight, where the electricity switches to being a cheaper rate. Most common is an economy 7, and then the cost of the electricity will revert to the usual day rate once the storage heaters have been charged. So the storage heaters will retain the heat and will gradually be released during the day. So that's where the output control, really adjusting that, ensures that by the time you get to the evening, all of the heat's not flooded out, and you're able to try and reduce the input where you can. Some of the more modern storage heaters, again, there's a lot of different models of them, but some of them will have built-in thermostats, which is pretty handy. You could say have the storage heater set to 20 degrees, say in the living room. Once the heat builds up to that, the storage heater will stop releasing the heat. Mm-hmm. And again, just helping you manage the heat during the day, so when it does come to charging again, it won't have to charge up from scratch. And a lot of the modern ones as well, you can set time periods for when the heat's released, and you can also they also might have fans in them that just blow the heat around the room a bit better. So for people that perhaps don't have a gas supply, renewables aren't an option, they've got older storage heating, then it can still be a viable option to upgrade to more modern, efficient storage heating, saving on their bills and also reducing their carbon footprint as well.
Okay, so if someone's thinking about how they make then that kind of big change, either they're talking about updating an existing heating system, or they're thinking about something new like a borehole in their house. Don't do that if you're in a tenement property. Again, your neighbours are going to be very upset, especially if you live in the top floor flat. But is there financial help for people to be able to do those sorts of big changes?
Yes.
Good, well, we'll finish there then.
We have an interest-free loan, so the Home Energy Scotland interest-free loan, which is funded by the Scottish Government, and it basically has pots of money available to fund all kinds of improvements within the home, depending on what is appropriate for a particular household.
And are those, I suppose, gated by any sort of income levels? So are those targeted at
no,
lower
not
income
at all.
people? They're available to anyone? No,
so we do have a grant-funded support also, which, there is sort of criteria to accessing that grant. But the interest-free loan that we have is available to anybody. So you would have a chat with us at Home Energy Scotland, you'd fill in your application, there's a credit check, affordability check, and that's it.
Wow, that's really simple. And that would cover, like, if it was solar panels, that would be solar panels. If it was ground source heat pumps.
Yeah, with your application you would include an energy performance certificate, which Liam mentioned before, so that would recommend improvements that were appropriate for your particular home. Mm-hmm. So if you have a recommendation on your energy performance certificate for room in the roof insulation, for example, then you'd be able to apply for that funding. If you're looking at renewables, we can actually put a report together to recommend that renewable system for you. So, for example, you mentioned solar panels. There's £5,000 worth of interest-free loan funding to help you cover that. And we would suggest that that's kind of an average install cost for sort of 12 or more solar panels.
That's good. And has Scottish Government set aside, like, is it a maximum amount of money, or if everyone in Edinburgh phoned you up tomorrow, firstly, that would be a very busy day for you. But do you have a cap in terms of the number of loans that you're looking to give, or?
So the loan is running for a financial year. We've had a very similar scheme for the last sort of 3 or 4 years. But yeah, it is a first come, first serve scheme. So if the money that had been set aside for the loan did run out, then of course we'd have to stop it, unfortunately. But right now it's available, open for applications. If you would like to give Home Energy Scotland a call for advice on any of the topics that we've discussed today, then our free phone number is 0808 808 2282.
That's great. So we'll probably see if we can make sure we've got some of that information on the Dialogue site as well. That's us for just now. I want to thank you both for coming along and having this conversation with us. If you've been interested in any of the ideas that we've covered today, you can come onto the Dialogue site. Links will be associated with this video, and continue that discussion with us. If from anything that you've heard here, you've got some ideas that you want to contribute to discussion, then please do that as well. But that's us for now. Thanks for listening, and thanks for taking part.
Thank you.
Thank you.